Thank you very much for having me. One of the tremendous challenges in the book 0 to 1 came out of a class on entrepreneurship that I taught at Stanford 2 years ago. And one of the great challenges in teaching entrepreneurship or writing about it is that there really is no formula, because every moment in the history of business, every moment in the history of technology happens only once. The next Mark Zuckerberg won't start a social networking site. The next Larry Page won't start a search engine. The next Bill Gates won't start a operating system company. And if you're copying these people, there's some sense in which you're not learning from them. And so one of the challenges in writing about entrepreneurship is this sense in which there is no formula. There's no real science to it. And what you have to instead do is sort of find value in fresh, strange, new places. And my book is sort of a long thought about how to do this. I try to get at it through sort of a series of different sort of contrarian questions. One of the questions is what great business is nobody building? The interview version of the question that I always like to ask, which is more intellectual, is tell me something that's true that almost nobody agrees with you on. And this always turns out to be a shockingly hard question for people to answer, even if they can read on the internet, this is a question I'm going to ask them in advance. And it's a hard question because we've been taught that truth is always what everybody agrees on. And so it sounds like you have to be really brilliant to come up with something new. And then it also, I think, is often sort of awkward or uncomfortable, because if you're telling something to people that if the interviewer agrees with your answer, you say something like, I don't know, like the education system's screwed up and needs to be improved. Well, that's not really a great insight, because almost everybody will agree with that. And so the good answers are ones people do not agree with, and I think that often requires a certain amount of courage, and we live in a world in which courage is in even shorter supply than genius. But I give a whole series of answers to this question in my book. But I'm going to focus on sort of one thematic one, which is that I think that it's this idea of uniqueness in business. I think most people tend to think that somehow business and competition are synonyms, and I think on some level they're antonyms. That competition, if you're doing something no one else is doing, if you have something that's a monopoly, you'll do really, really well. If you're engaged in cutthroat competition, all the profits are competed away. And so if you want to compete like crazy, the standard example I give is you should just open a restaurant, which is super competitive and nobody ever makes any money doing it. And then the example of a good business that I always give is sort of the tech monopolies, and Google is sort of the paradigm example, where they've had no competition in search since 2002, and that's why you had these enormous profits. The opening line of Anna Karenina is, all happy families are alike, all unhappy families are unhappy in their own special way. And I think the opposite is true of business. I think all happy companies are different because they found something radically unique that they do that no one else in the world is doing. All unhappy companies are alike because they fail to escape the essential sameness that is competition. When the Wall Street Journal sort of excerpted my book, they changed the title from All Happy Companies Are Different to Competition is for Losers, which I think sort of gets at this in a sort of even more direct way. And I think there are several different reasons that this monopoly versus competition idea is understood so poorly. One is sort of an intellectual reason, which is that the companies that have monopolies never talk about it, and the companies that don't have monopolies, that are competing like crazy, pretend that they're still unique. And so the people who have monopolies pretend not to have them. The people who don't have monopolies pretend to have them. And so the apparent difference is really small when the actual difference is foundational. And so if you're running Google, you will never even talk about it being a search engine. You will instead talk about how it's a technology company, and there's tremendous competition with Apple on Android and with Facebook on social, and with Microsoft on the Office docs, and with the car companies with the self-driving car, and there's just competition everywhere. And it's not the monopoly the government's looking for. And on the other end of the spectrum, if you are trying to open a restaurant in San Francisco and you're talking to some investors, and they'll say, well, I don't want to give you any money because you just lose money if you invest in a restaurant. You'd be incented to come up with some somewhat fictional story about how this is going to be the only British Nepalese fusion cuisine within in the Mission area of San Francisco. And so the monopolists exaggerate the size of their markets to hide their monopoly. The people who are in cutthroat competition come up with artificially small markets to sort of pretend that they have viable businesses over the long run. So I think this is sort of the very important theme that always ends up being obscured in one way or another. But I think there's also a little bit of a psychological part to this, where I think there are sort of all these disturbing ways that we are often attracted to competition, and this is why if you say competition is for losers, that's so against the convention, because the convention is that the losers are the people who can't compete that effectively. And you think about, I don't know, like a high school sports team, or people who can't get into the top universities because they didn't do quite as well on the standardized tests. So we always think of losers as the people who are bad at competing. We don't think that the people who are super focused on competition are somehow setting themselves up to be losers, because they're attracted to the things that where you're going to be competing like crazy. And I think this sort of psychology, I think already in the time of Shakespeare, the word ape meant both primate and to imitate. And there is something very deep about human nature that involves imitation, that involves copying. It's how we learn language when we grow up. It's how culture gets transmitted in our society. But it also leads to sort of all sorts of insane behavior. It leads to sort of the madness of crowds. It leads to bubbles. It leads to all sorts of people trying to go through the same small door when there's a giant gate right around the corner that no one wants to take. And I think that I think the Silicon Valley version of this that's often quite interesting is the strange sense in which so many of the successful companies are started by people who seem to be suffering from a mild form of Asperger's, and you always wonder why that is, or and I think it should be we should always flip this around and turn this into a critique of our society, where what is it about our society where anyone who does not have Asperger's gets talked out of their heterodox ideas, their unconventional ideas, before they're even fully formed, because you get a sense that people look at you as though it's a little bit weird, it's a little bit strange, it doesn't quite make sense, perhaps you shouldn't do this, and you sort of get talked out of this even faster than before you even have them fully formed. I think there's a sort of a special risk of this in a business school context. They've done these studies at Harvard Business School where they found that I often think of a business school, people who go to business schools, as being sort of the anti-Asperger extreme, where it's sort of really extroverted and often just sort of trying to figure out what people want to do. And when you go to business school for 2 years, one of the big risks is always that you end up talking to everybody else around you about what are you going to do, what are you going to be doing in 2 years' time, and then people, the largest cohort, sort of decides to try to catch the last wave. They've done these studies at Harvard Business School where this is sort of the recurrent theme, that whatever the largest number of people end up doing is always the wrong thing. And so in 1989, everybody went and worked for Michael Milken in junk bonds. It was 1 or 2 years before he went to jail. No one ever wanted to do anything in Silicon Valley except 99, 2000 when HBS perfectly timed the end of the dot-com bubble. You had a version of this in 05 to 07 where something like this happened with housing and private equity. And so I do think this is that there's always a psychological part of this. I think there's a question I will leave unanswered and barely asked is whether there are things about the gay experience that make us more prone to this or less prone, or if there are some things unique about that. But I think that's an important question for all of us to think about. If escaping from competition is critical, we need to really think through in what ways we're sort of perversely attracted to it, in what ways we think it validates us when in reality it's not the wisdom of crowds. It's when you do the same thing as the crowd, you're stuck with a lot of people who are competing. And there's sort of an autobiographical part of this, which is that if I sort of had to give advice to my younger self, it would be something very much along these lines, because I sort of grew up in this sort of hyper-tracked, hyper-competitive kind of a context. My 8th grade yearbook in junior high school, one of my friends wrote in and said, I know you're going to go to Stanford in 4 or 5 years, and yeah, sure enough, that's what I did. And then, good grades, good test scores, went to Stanford Law School, ended up at a top law firm in Manhattan. And one of the sort of the very strange dynamics was that sort of once you ended up there, it was a strange place where from the outside everybody wanted to get in, on the inside everybody wanted to get out. And when I left after 7 months and 3 days, it was one of the people down the hall told me, I didn't realize it was possible to escape from Alcatraz. It's so reassuring to see you leave. And of course, all you had to do was go out the front door. It wasn't literally Alcatraz, but the psychology, so much of the identity people had was wrapped up in winning these competitions, and that it was utterly inconceivable for people to leave. And I sort of think of myself as having had this sort of rolling quarter-life crisis during my 20s, where I became sort of increasingly disenchanted with all the different ways that I'd been set up to compete, where if you lose, you're always devastated. If you win, it's never actually that clear that you're winning at something that's the right thing to be focused on. Because what I think competition does is it does make us better at whatever we're competing on. It sort of makes us focus on the people we're competing against, and we get better at the things we're competing on. But I think it always comes at this very high price of narrowing our focus and perhaps losing sight of some things that might be really much more important or much more valuable. And I think it's always critical for us to maintain that focus. And I think this sort of anti-competition theme is obviously, I think, a good one to focus on if you're founding a company. You don't want to do the 4th online pet food company or the 10th thin film solar panel company or the 100th pizza restaurant in San Francisco. But it's also, I think, there are all these other contexts. So it's like if you're managing people. I've always said if you're a sociopathic boss and you want to just create trouble for the people who are working for you, the straightforward formula for doing it is you always tell 2 people to do the exact same thing, and you will create conflict automatically. And so if you don't want to do that, you should always think about how do you differentiate people's roles, make sure that there's things are as non-competitive as possible so that there's as little conflict and people are working as productively as possible. So I think this is sort of a very powerful theme that we should rethink in all these ways. Anyway, there's a lot more I could say, but I thought it would be best to make it as interactive as possible. So just take some time for some questions and answers. Thank you. Let me say, I don't. Let's say I don't. I don't have a background in computer science specifically. So I think. So let me just frame it as not as philosophy, but is there room for people who don't have a background in computer science? And I think there's a lot for that in Silicon Valley. I think it is probably at this point slightly too skewed towards engineering and slightly too far removed from everything else. I'm still a very big fan of the two company founding team where one person's more technical, one person is more on the business side, and these two things are very complementary. And it's worth sort of reflecting a little bit on the history of Silicon Valley and how this has changed, because I think this was sort of the paradigm in the 90s, that you'd have sort of a business person working with a more technical person, and they had very different complementary skills that you'd use to build the business. And it was sort of the 1999 version at PayPal. You had sort of all the smart engineering people, and then all the talented non-engineering people was a question, what should they be doing? And in '99, it was all business development. It was all sort of looking out, working with other companies. By 2001, it had all shifted to being internal, where all the talented people were working on product. And I think this shift from '99 to 2001 was paradigmatic of what happened in the entire tech industry, where the 90s tech CEO was often someone like, I don't know, Larry Ellison was like the salesman in chief. The 2000 CEO was sort of the product engineering person, where the focus was much more inward looking, much less outward looking. I think it was sort of a defensive reaction to the aftermath of the bubble, where it turned out that lots of companies didn't like Silicon Valley. They thought people here were obnoxious, and so it didn't make sense to try to find ways to work with the outside world. But I think it was an overreaction. I think we're sort of at a point where it would be really valuable to look at some businesses where you try to combine the two. Everyone scared? Any more questions?
Sure, I've got one. So you barely asked the question and didn't quite answer it, but there is one thing that we all have in common in this room here, which is, well, most of us, is that we weren't born into our community or culture as it relates to being LGBT. It's something that is an affinity and brings us together. Could you just elaborate a bit more on your thinking about, do you think, because of our shared experience of not being born into a gay family and having a gay culture, but having to go out and find it, our shared experience of if you can't pass, being an outsider, how you feel that plays out in business and entrepreneurship as an advantage or disadvantage?
It's always, it's quite hard to, I think it's quite hard to say. I think it has both advantages and disadvantages. There's definitely this problem of discrimination, which I think is much less now than it was 10 or 20 years ago. There probably are still a lot of subtle ways that it's, there's still a lot of subtle disadvantages. I think there is, I think it is a big challenge for celebrities or CEOs of Fortune 500 companies to be openly gay, because even though the people at their companies or the people in Hollywood might be tolerant, you're often speaking to a global audience, and so there's a way in which globalization has often made this more challenging. And whereas if you were, say, just doing things in California, it might be very different. I think that so I think there are sort of all these things that are quite tricky about it. The version of the question that I'm focused on, which I don't have I think is the right question, but I'm not sure I really have the answer to, is there something about the gay experience, being gay, the gay experience, that pushes us even more than other people towards competition, and is this a reason that we end up sometimes underperforming because maybe we're insecure about things, we want to get validated by winning various competitions, and then perversely that very process somehow sets us up for underperforming relative to well we do. And I do think, and that's sort of the speculative thought I have. I think that I have a lot of super talented gay friends where I always wonder whether they've somehow underperformed relative to what someone similar who is straight would have done. And there's a question, how much of this is sort of social discrimination, and how much is it possible that they're sort of systematically going into the wrong industries, the wrong fields, that they're somehow attracted to fields that are even more competitive? And is there something about that drives us? I think that's always a question I have in the back of my mind.
Hi, Bradley Powell from Chicago booth. Thank you for joining. To turn it around, what is your best idea right now that no one agrees with?
You know, I have a lot of them, but you know, the super flip answer I always have is that most people think that's an easy question to answer, and I think it's a hard question to answer. But I think it's, you know, I'd say within the technology sector where I'm very focused. I don't know. There's sort of all these things that are, you know, there's so many different ones I can give. Within the technology sector, I think one of the things that I'm always skeptical of is anything that's thematic. Because I think once it's thematic, it means that lots of people are talking about it. So I'm skeptical of educational software. I'm skeptical of healthcare IT software. I'm skeptical of cloud computing, big data. Those are like horrible buzzwords. It's not even clear what they mean or if they even exist. I think it's all sort of borderline fraudulent. Skeptical of SaaS accounting, skeptical SaaS software, skeptical of, and then I think the sort of things that actually work are the kinds of things that are one of a kind, that don't quite fit into any conventional narrative, and that in some sense it's actually hard to know quite how to describe or how to talk about them, and that's why there's no sort of overarching narrative, and that's what's sort of very undervalued. You know, we're investors in Airbnb, and so that's a company that I think is relatively undervalued because there's no straightforward category into which it fits. You could say it's you know, you can say it's the sharing economy, the sort of things they try to come up with, but it's really just this weird new service that enables people to do things with their houses, and it sort of expands the tourism industry in some interesting ways, but it's this new service that doesn't quite fit into any categories. And I think it's things like this that are very undervalued. So I always think these psychological questions are really important. As an investor, I think it's always, you know, there's sort of a question, there's always these biases other investors have. And one of the standard biases people have is to overvalue whatever they're doing. And so I think investors tend to be very biased towards things they themselves use, and they're biased against things they don't use. And so there's probably, you know, probably Airbnb is undervalued relative to Uber, because a lot of investors like driving black town cars. They don't like, but they like staying in 5-star hotels, not surfing on people's couches. And so they're sort of relatively underestimating Airbnb, overestimating Uber. I think this was actually one of the reasons Facebook was super undervalued for the first 2.5 years, because no investors were in college. And only the people who were in college really understood the intensity of the usage that was going on for the first 2.5 years till Facebook became available to other people. So I'm always really interested in these sort of I think these psychological questions are always much more important than we realize. And so yeah, go ahead.
That he brought to a social enterprise summit that we attended was about solving death. And then I know that that was something that Google was searching. That to me is a very disruptive idea and not necessarily a business idea. Can you talk a little bit about that? what does that mean, and what are the business implications of ending death?
Well, I'm not sure it's like just a narrow single business, certainly, but I think it's a big problem that we should work on solving. You know, there are about 100,000 people who die every day on this planet. Most of them die from things linked to old age, and so I think this question of what causes aging, why does it happen, is a super underexplored question. It's possible that if we were to explore it more, there would be some interesting things you learn. You know, if you're 30 years old, you have a 1 in 1,000 chance of getting cancer your next year. If you're 80 years old, you have a 1 in 10 chance of getting cancer in the next year. And so there are all these things that are sort of linked to aging, which is why I think it's an important thing to study. You know, it's at age 85, 1 out of 3 people has dementia, and so you know, it's really worth trying to understand how all these things work. And again, I think the psychology around this stuff is really, really crazy, where I think that the way people generally deal with death is through this sort of schizophrenic combination of acceptance and denial. And even though acceptance and denial are two opposite extremes, you know, acceptance is sort of this super pessimistic thing, nothing I can do about it. Denial is super optimistic, it's never going to happen to me. But this sort of combination of extreme pessimism and extreme optimism functionally leads to the same thing, because when you're extremely pessimistic or extremely optimistic, you conclude there's nothing you need to do or nothing you can do, and so you don't do anything. And so even though these opposite extremes, they somehow end up getting to the exact same place. And so I think it would be good for us to have a slightly different attitude that was somewhere between extreme optimism and extreme pessimism, and instead of acceptance and denial being the dominant modes, that we fight a little bit more. Yeah.
Do you think competition serves any useful purpose?
Well, it's always a question of from whose perspective. I mean, there's always sort of a society perspective where you can say competition makes things cheaper, or you know, create the sort of our markets that end up doing things. You know, we have really good restaurants in San Francisco, and so it's good for a consumer point of view. But I think that from the point of view of the person doing things, from the point of view of a founder, of an entrepreneur, from the point of view of someone going into business, starting a career, you always want to be as far away from this as possible. And so, yeah, sometimes you get stuck in competitive dynamics, you know, and you just have to win. But you don't want to sort of accept competition too automatically. You don't want to say, like, if you say everything's competitive, I think that sort of obscures too much, because then you ignore how some things are a lot more competitive than others, how some things are a lot harder than others, and there are sort of, I think, a lot of gradations and nuances to this that are, you know, really, really important to think through. Yeah.
My name is Owen Liu, and I'm currently an entrepreneur. So I was just reading your book. I'm just wondering if there's one thing that we can take away from your book, what is it?
Well, I hope there's more than one thing. I mean, the one thing is the one thing I hammer home over and over again is this monopoly versus competition idea, and then it's just there's sort of so many different permutations on this. But you know, it's this is my shameless plug for my book. You know, most business books tell you how to compete more effectively with other people. Mine tells you not to compete. So you could say most business books are competing with one another to tell you how to compete more with other people. And mine is the one book that tells you not to compete at all. And it's not competing with any other business books. Thank you very much.